You know the image. 300 bronze warriors at a narrow pass. The greatest soldiers the ancient world ever produced, dying to the last man for freedom. Sparta gave us one of history's most enduring legends. The ultimate warrior society, hard, noble, and free. But the movies and the school books stop the story right there, at the glory. What they leave out is how those warriors were made, and what their perfect society was built on top of. Because behind the shields and the discipline, Sparta ran a system that stole boys from their families to be starved and beaten, that inspected newborns and discarded the ones it judged unworthy, and, most disturbing of all, that maintained a secret band of young men whose job was to move through the countryside at night and murder the state's own people to keep them afraid. This is the Sparta the legend was built to hide, and every word of it comes from ancient writers who admired the place. To understand Sparta's darkest customs, you have to understand what Sparta actually was, because it was not a nation of free citizens the way we'd imagine. Sparta was a war machine, and everything in it existed to serve that single purpose. A relatively small class of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, lived as professional warriors. Forbidden from farming, trade, or ordinary labor, they could live this way because beneath them was a vast population of enslaved people called Helots, who worked the land, grew the food, and did the labor that freed the Spartans to train for war their entire lives. The Helots vastly outnumbered their masters, by most ancient estimates several times over, perhaps far more. And that single fact, a small warrior elite sitting on top of a huge enslaved majority, is the key that unlocks every brutal thing Sparta did. Sparta was a society living in permanent structural fear of the people it oppressed. The historian Thucydides observed that much of Spartan policy was shaped by the constant need to guard against the Helots. Fear was the engine of the state. Into this system a Spartan was born, and from the very first moment the individual belonged not to his family but to the state. According to the biographer Plutarch, writing centuries later about Sparta's legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, a newborn was not simply handed to its parents. It was brought before a council of elders of the tribe for inspection. If the child was judged sturdy and well-formed, it was allowed to live and assigned a plot of land. If it was judged weak, sickly, or ill-formed, the elders ordered it taken away and exposed, abandoned to die, according to Plutarch, at a place associated with a chasm near a mountain, a spot he calls the Apothete, the place of rejection. Now, honesty requires a caveat here, and it matters. Modern historians treat Plutarch's account with real caution. He wrote long after classical Sparta had faded, and the Spartan Mirage, the glamorized, exaggerated image of Sparta, had already grown thick by his time. Some archaeological work at the supposed site has complicated the literal story. So we should say clearly, the precise, systematic infant exposure Plutarch describes may be part legend, but the principle it expresses was openly stated and consistent with everything else we know. In Sparta, a life was worth keeping only if the state judged it useful. Your right to exist was conditional from birth. And that principle is not in doubt. That was only the beginning of what the state would take. The system that turned Spartan boys into the ancient world's most feared soldiers was called the Agoge, and it was designed to break a child down and rebuild him as a weapon. At around the age of 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his home and his mother and enrolled in the state-run upbringing, where he would live communally with other boys under harsh discipline, organized into packs and troops under the authority of older youths and overseers. From that point, his education was not primarily in reading or philosophy, but in endurance, obedience, cunning, and the tolerance of pain. The boys were kept deliberately underfed, hungry enough that they were expected to supplement their meager rations by stealing food. But here the system revealed its cruel logic. Stealing was encouraged as training in stealth and survival, yet a boy who was caught stealing was punished severely, not for the theft itself, but for the failure of being caught. Plutarch preserves the famous, chilling illustration of this ethic, the story of a boy who had stolen a young fox and hidden it beneath his cloak, and who let the animal tear into his own belly with its teeth and claws rather than be discovered, enduring in silence until he collapsed and died. Whether legend or fact, the Spartans told that story about themselves, as an ideal to admire. It tells you exactly what they wanted their sons to become, boys who would rather be gutted than shamed. The toughening went further. The boys were exposed to cold with minimal clothing, made to sleep on hard beds of reeds they gathered themselves, and subjected to ritualized ordeals of endurance. One of the most notorious was a rite at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where youths were flogged, in some accounts brutally, as a test of their ability to endure pain without flinching, a contest of endurance that spectators came to watch and that in later Roman times became a kind of tourist spectacle. The whole apparatus was engineered to produce men who felt no fear, questioned no order, and placed the group above the self absolutely. And here is the uncomfortable part. It worked. The Agoge really did forge the discipline, cohesion, and contempt for death that made Spartan armies legendary across the Greek world. The society that discarded weak infants and starved and beat its children also produced the soldiers who stood at the pass and did not run. The glory and the cruelty were not separate systems. One was manufactured by the other. You cannot have the 300 without the machine that made them. And now the custom that the legend works hardest to bury, the one that shows what Sparta truly was underneath the bronze. Because the Spartans lived in constant dread of a Helot uprising, they needed a way to keep that enormous enslaved population terrified, divided, and leaderless. Their solution was an institution the ancient writers called the Krypteia, a word rooted in the idea of hiding or secrecy. According to Plutarch, who explicitly cites the philosopher Aristotle as his source, selected young Spartan men, among the most promising of their generation, were sent out into the countryside armed with daggers and carrying only basic provisions. By day they hid, by night they moved, and their task was to fall upon the Helots to kill them. In some accounts they were directed especially toward the strongest, boldest, and most capable Helots, precisely the men who might one day lead a rebellion. It was, in plain terms, a state-sanctioned program of secret assassination aimed at the state's own workforce, carried out by its finest use as a kind of rite of passage into full manhood. Aristotle, as reported by Plutarch, preserved an even more revealing detail: that each year upon taking office, the Spartan magistrates, the ephors, formally declared war on the Helots. Why? So that killing a Helot would carry no religious pollution, no blood guilt, because it was an act of war rather than murder. Read that again. The mass enslaved population of Sparta was placed by annual official decree into a permanent state of war with its own masters so that murdering them was rendered legally and spiritually clean. This is administrative cruelty of a very deliberate and bureaucratic kind. It was not a mob or a massacre in a moment of panic. It was a policy, renewed on a schedule with the paperwork done in advance. The historian Thucydides, a sober, careful contemporary, not a myth maker, records the episode that shows how far this fear could drive the Spartans. He describes an occasion when the Spartans, uneasy about the Helots who had served bravely in their armies, announced that those Helots who had shown the greatest courage in Sparta's service should be identified, so they could be rewarded with their freedom. Around 2,000 Helots were selected, celebrated, crowned with garlands, and led around the temples as free men. And then Thucydides reports they vanished, and no one ever knew exactly how each of them was destroyed. The Spartans had used the promise of freedom as a filter to identify precisely the boldest, most capable, most dangerous men among the enslaved, the very ones most likely to lead a revolt, and had them quietly eliminated. It is one of the coldest, most calculated acts of statecraft recorded in the entire ancient world, and it comes down to us not from Sparta's enemies but from one of the most respected historians of the age. So why do we inherit the 300 heroes and not the nighttime killings? Why is the Agoge remembered as noble discipline and not as institutionalized child abuse? Part of the answer is that Sparta was a brilliant manager of its own image, even in its own time. The Spartans cultivated a mystique, what modern historians call the Spartan Mirage, of austere virtue, iron self-control, and unshakable courage that dazzled other Greeks, including admiring thinkers like Xenophon, who lived among them and wrote glowingly of their system, and Plato, who borrowed elements of Spartan discipline for his ideal state. That admiration, coming from the most influential writers of the age, shaped how Sparta was recorded and remembered for all time. The Spartans marketed their strengths and let the machinery behind them stay in shadow, which is easy to do when your entire culture is built on secrecy, silence, and the deliberate concealment of your own affairs from outsiders. Part of the answer is that the Helots left no voice of their own. History is written by those who write, and the enslaved majority of Sparta, the people the Krypteia hunted, produced no historians, no memoirs, no monuments, no epitaphs. Their suffering survives only in the passing remarks of their masters and their masters' admirers. When one entire side of a story is silent, the other side becomes the whole story by default. And part of the answer is simply that we want the legend. 300 men choosing death for freedom is a story that thrills, inspires, and flatters our hunger for heroism. A death squad murdering enslaved farmers in the dark to keep a subject population afraid is a story that indicts. Given the choice between the two, cultures reach for the version that ennobles. So the pass at Thermopylae went into every schoolbook and every film, and the Krypteia became a footnote that most people never read. The fine print of a legend we prefer to keep clean. There are two more pieces of the Spartan system worth knowing, because they complete the picture of a society engineered down to its bones for war, and one of them is genuinely surprising. The first is the common mess. Every full Spartan citizen belonged to a communal dining group and was required to eat there, taking his meals not with his family but with his fellow warriors every day for most of his life. Membership had to be approved by the existing members, and a man who could not contribute his share of provisions could lose his standing as a full citizen. The food was famously austere. The centerpiece was a notorious dish the rest of Greece found revolting, a dark broth made with pork and blood, of which visitors reportedly said it was easy to understand why the Spartans faced death so willingly, if that was what they had to eat while living. But the mess was not really about food. It was about welding men permanently to their military unit and preventing the private luxury, wealth, and family softness that Sparta feared would rot its warrior discipline. And the flip side was merciless. A Spartan who showed cowardice in battle, the men they called the Tremblers, was subjected to public humiliation and social exclusion so total that death was considered preferable. The system policed courage with shame at every level. The second piece is the one that surprises people: Spartan women. In a Greek world that generally confined respectable women to the home and gave them little freedom, Spartan women were strikingly different. Because Spartan men were consumed entirely by military life, women ran the households and controlled significant property. By some ancient accounts, a large share of Spartan land eventually came into women's hands. Girls, unlike almost anywhere else in Greece, received physical education and athletic training, running, wrestling, throwing, as because Sparta believed strong mothers produced strong warrior sons. Spartan women were famous across Greece for speaking their minds boldly and for a fierce patriotism. The legendary line attributed to a Spartan mother, telling her son to come home from battle either carrying his shield or carried dead upon it, captures the ideal. But even this relative freedom served the machine. Women were valued as the producers and hardeners of soldiers, and marriage customs were bent toward maximizing healthy offspring for the state. In Sparta, even liberty was a tool of war. Sparta really did produce the ancient world's most formidable warriors. That was never a myth. The myth is the idea that they came from a noble, admirable place. They came from a society that inspected its babies, and by its own openly stated principle, kept only the ones it judged useful. That took its 7-year-olds and starved and beat them into weapons. And that maintained a secret brotherhood of killers to hold down the enslaved majority its entire way of life depended on. The shields and the courage were real. So were the rejected infants and the nighttime daggers. You cannot keep one without the other, because in Sparta, they were the same system, forged in the same fire. The next time you see those 300 spears raised in slow motion, remember what stood behind them, in the dark, with a knife. And if you want the version of history that includes what the legend leaves out, subscribe. We do this every few days because some things weren't forgotten by accident. They were buried, very deliberately, under a better story.